Okay, thank you for that excellent introduction. I will present to you my published paper, Discovery Reduction of Photosynthesis Correlation to Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide Increase. This is my 13th presentation of this. I will show you how atmospheric CO2 is not an emissions issue. We've tried that and it doesn't work. I will also show you how sea level rise is not accelerating. Follow the data. Everyone should follow the data, not some agenda. I'll show you global carbon atlas. I'll show you why atmospheric CO2 is not our emissions, where we are, Mauna Loa growth rate, where we're going, the future, what the photosynthesis issues are, and the correct solution for atmospheric carbon dioxide with results. I'll also show you how the global warming potential of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is false. So use all the data, don't cherry pick. See what the data says, perform statistical analysis. All models, and let me underline that, all models must be verified with actual data. This presentation is a result of following the data. Nature Climate Change has been a farce journal. Until July, they had a chief editor whose PhD was in political science. He was just there to let the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change publish garbage papers so that they could circular reference them in their manuscripts or in their reports. As any scientist knows, circular referencing is not science. Global Carbon Atlas. So in the USA, United States, we've had a 16% decrease in CO2 since 2006. Europe has had a 21% decrease of CO2 since 1990. And this is where we are. After spending $2.8 trillion, we have the graph on the left, you can see this anywhere on the internet, is not updated since 2012. And the reason why is because since 2014, we've had mostly flat emissions with a 3% drop last year. And I suspect this year with this COVID-19 thing, we'll have a 3 or 4, maybe 6% drop worldwide by the end of the year. But atmospheric CO2 is going up and the correlation coefficient is now 0.64, so it's not cause and effect of emissions for atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is the growth rate of Mauna Loa and the cyclic nature of Mauna Loa you can see here. And the residence time is 150 years. It used to be 5 years. Most work is on carbon emissions reduction, and assumptions is keep the current carbon dioxide emissions level at 35 billion metric tons. Decreasing in carbon dioxide emissions will be offset by increases in population, and atmospheric carbon dioxide stays the same slope. At 100 years, we have no more oil, so carbon dioxide emissions drop by 30%. This is residence time of CO2. These are 160 PhDs and 19 published manuscripts on residence time. The lowest one is 150 years. If you were to look at this as just data, you'd see, well, probably it's really around 220 years, something like that. And another way to look at residence time is there a signature from any past events which lowered CO2 emissions. This is the graph from Mauna Loa. Anybody can go there today and get it. I grabbed this just the other day to add to this presentation, the updated one. We had an oil embargo in the 1970s, multiple recessions, worldwide recession in 2009, this COVID-19 pandemic, and you can see there's no effect in the actual data for any of these things. And another separate proof of this on Netflix, you can watch Kiss the Ground movie. They explain that even if we stopped all CO2 emissions, we quit breathing and everything, atmospheric CO2 will not lower. They call it CO2, the load of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it's really residence time. And this is what I said before, the assumptions. Correlation of emissions versus the CO2 rise goes to zero at 580 ppm at year 2060. In other words, at 2060, anybody looking at this would say, why are you guys working on carbon dioxide emissions? That's not the cause and effect. And this is Pearson's regression. So first I should have said that atmospheric CO2 is a binary system statistically. And I told this to Jim Scaya, who said we had to reduce our emissions by 45%. And he said, I agree. And it's a binary system because emissions, although they're multivariate, are one side, and loss of photosynthesis, that's also multivariate, is the other side. So that makes it into a binary system, emissions versus loss of photosynthesis. And CO2 emissions correlate to a value of 363 parts per million. And as I said, are not cause and effect of the rise. So what is the cause and effect of the rise? And here's again why it's not our emissions. 90% of the people live in the Northern Hemisphere. And so 90% of our emissions would look like this at Mauna Loa. But this is not what Mauna Loa looks like. This is what Mauna Loa looks like. So again, it's not our emissions that are causing this rise. And as a chemical engineer, we're taught 80-some tank models. The simplest one is like your kitchen sink, and it accurately describes atmospheric CO2. We have human and natural CO2 as the inputs, and we have, as the outputs, diffusion and photosynthesis, or loss thereof of photosynthesis. And we have the residence time increasing and the tank filling. So if you come home and your kitchen sink has the water level rise and the water level's been sitting there for a while, that's residence time, water's residing longer, you know you have to shut off the input and fix the drain. Well, we can't shut off the input because we have all this natural CO2, plus we have to breathe. So we need to work on photosynthesis. And atmospheric CO2 by latitude, this is courtesy of Dr. Peter Tons of Mauna Loa. We worked on this in 1980, flat across in 2017, still pretty much flat across the latitudes. The atmospheric winds keep all greenhouse gases equal or pretty much equal throughout the Earth. And this is Mauna Loa harmonic trend. You can see the strong yellow line at the South Pole or in the Southern Hemisphere. So this gives us a clue as to where the cause of the rise of CO2 is. And city sprawl is 1 billion tons lost of CO2 consumption annually. The IPCC estimates wrongly that 2 to 3 billion tons of lost CO2 consumption. Deforestation of 30 million acres annually of the Amazon rainforest is 90 million tons lost CO2 consumption. Total 60 billion tons lost since 1950. More than 300 billion tons lost of CO2 consumption annually from the Amazon rainforest switching to an oxygen sink and a carbon dioxide producer. This is 19 times our emissions output. This is our equilibrium paper, the first one to actually calculate what net zero CO2e is. And net zero CO2e is 8.6 billion tons, not the 28 billion that the IPCC is lying about. Northern Hemisphere forests only consume 2.6 billion tons a year. This is not what lowers Mauna Loa in the summertime in the Northern Hemisphere. All tropical forests in the Southern Hemisphere is switched to become oxygen consumers and carbon dioxide producers due to organic decay. We have a 5 times increase in CO2 emissions, mainly from fossil fuel burning, but we have a 97% decrease in photosynthesis consumption worldwide. This is the reason why CO2 is going up. Nothing to do with what these guys have been saying for 30 years. The diffusion of CO2 in the troposphere is also towards the exosphere. So the World Economic Forum has said we rightly need to plant 1 trillion trees. 35 billion tons of human emissions, 3 billion are deforestation issues, and the switch of the Amazon to an oxygen sink is 15 billion tons of unaccounted for CO2. So our actual CO2 emissions are around 50, not 35. This is Global Forest Watch. You can go there, click on the map and see this, all this purple. That's non-sustainable deforestation. They're just mowing down the trees. And this is why we used to have 390 billion tons of photosynthesis. We only have 8.6 billion tons remaining. This is the reason why atmospheric CO2 is going up. And the Amazon rainforest is a 0.99 cause and effect correlation to the rise of CO2, not emissions. And the Amazon rainforest since 1950 started deforestation. 1957, the carbon dioxide started the current increase. In the 1970s, trees and plants started toppling over because they grew too fast from the extra carbon dioxide emitted from the burning of the 30 million acres of the Amazon. And the burning of biomass from each acre causes a minimum of 1 billion CO2 released annually in 6 months. The 1990s change over to an oxygen sink and a carbon dioxide producer, massive decay, and all this, we've lost 20% of Earth's oxygen production because of this also. This is what they do in the Amazon. You think this has anything to do with the CO2 increase? And this is the loss of production worldwide. You can see it cycles just like the increase in the CO2. These two things are coupled together. And this is a 0.98 cause and effect correlation to this for the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So the correct solution for atmospheric CO2 moratorium on the rainforest, deforestation starting now, plant native trees and shrubs all over the world, 3.5 new, actually now it's 5 billion new in the last 2.5 years that I've caused to be planted. Stop deforestation in India and everywhere else where it's non-sustainable. And these are planting ideas. And this all government policy document is on the homepage of cctruth.org. And the new paradigm. We work on photosynthesis. We get somewhere around 90 to 130 billion tons of consumption, and atmospheric CO2 drops to 330 ppm by 2031. There's no way to do this by working on emissions of CO2. And results. With 1 billion trees planted, we had flat data in December for the first time in 2019. And then this is last March. We had flat March for the first time in 70 years. And if you look at right now what's going on Mauna Loa CO2, you'll see that since November till now, we've had flat CO2 also. Normally between, as you see in that cycle before, between November and May, it increases around 1.5 parts per million per month. But now with these 5 billion trees planted and stopping the Indian rainforest, we've had flat CO2. And this is fraud of Mauna Loa. We had flat CO2 in February, it continued on here. Then their analyzer went down and they saw that it didn't go up. So they put in an offset here, and that offset was 1.500 parts per million. So it was wrong. We put in a complaint and they're investigating it. This is our state of Oregon sanctioned experiment. This is the treat area here, and this is the non-treat area with the same traffic. It's about 180,000 autos per day. We have 2 NIST certified carbon dioxide sensors calibrated within 1 parts per million. And the treat area was 28 parts per million in August. But still in December, I just finished this last Friday, was 15 parts per million in December. So Mark Rosen talked about carbon capture technology, that's trees. You plant trees, this proves at least that we're at 50 latitude right now. So plus or minus 60 latitude from the equator. If you plant native shrubs and trees in the freeway mediums and on the sides of freeways and roads, they'll consume a large portion of the CO2 from vehicles. And then you can tweet this. We have a sponsored article in the Rio Times here, and you can tweet this to the Amazon leaders, and Peru said they'll stop, hopefully this month, they're going to stop deforestation. We get Brazil and everyone else, we get back at least 90 billion tons of consumption in 3 years. And then the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports are excuse me, science fiction. CO2 does not freeze in the mesosphere. The freezing point in the mesosphere is here, but with the pressure in the mesosphere, the freezing point of CO2 is much below that. And here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports are science fiction review of SR 1.5, Chapter 2, mitigation. The equilibrium statement that Jim Skea said we had to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030 had no reference to any publication. They made it up. The actual equilibrium, as I said, is 8.6 billion tons, and their only probability for their solution to work by lowering emissions of CO2 is 50 to 66%. So I ask you, would you take your car to a mechanic who said they could fix it 50 to 66% of the time? Yet we scientists have believed these guys and trusted them, and nobody even reads their reports. And the working group 1 second order draft, the scientific consensus is 33%, not 97%. And their global warming potential is false because it assumes equal concentrations of greenhouse gases. Currently, CO2 is 412 and methane is 1.8, and they'll never be the same. Furthermore, this global warming potential was published in the Farce Journal of Nature Climate Change. And again, it was just published there so they could do circular referencing. Another fact about it is in the 1970s and 80s, there were published manuscripts that show the correct order of greenhouse gases that they did not verify their model with. So their model is false. The sea level rise is 1.1 millimeter per year and not accelerating. The Jacobson Glacier in Greenland has grown for the last 3 years. And the residence time, like I said, is 150 years. And Netflix, watch Kiss the Ground movie, use of unscientific terms. They use unscientific terms like highly or otherwise likely, which is, they should use probability. And the graph, as I showed you before, that they say is cause and effect for emissions has not been updated since 2012. And this is Dr. Blasing's data. In 2014, he shows that CO2 is 1.94, methane is 0.5, and so on. So this is why their global warming potential model is false. And sea level rise, different measures and consistent results, apparently unaffected by recent CO2 increases. Future of New York City, not going to happen. No reliability in Noaa sea level measurements. The Noaa satellite has a minimum resolution of 25 millimeters. It's like using a yardstick with no gradations and putting an unfamiliar object 20 feet away and then performing measurements. The data would not be reliable. And like I said, tide gauges and different measurements by satellite. And this is the tide gauges. And for Accra, Ghana, there's some tide gauges there. I'll try to get those and send it to Anthony. And satellite systems, this is satellite systems. And the satellite is 3.3 millimeters per year, but it's still linear and not increasing. What they do is they attach this to the tide gauge graph and it makes it look like it's increasing, but it's not. These are the tide gauges are accelerating. These are tide gauges. You see some of them are decreasing, some of them are increasing slightly, but they're all linear. And summary, atmospheric CO2 is not caused by carbon dioxide emissions, caused mainly by a loss of photosynthesis. Does not freeze in the upper atmosphere, and sea level rise is not accelerating. My contact data is research@cctruth.org. And if Mark or anyone wants to do that experiment, I'll be finished with these CO2 sensors in June. and then I could ship them to anybody who wants to do the experiment in their location. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.